Hi, Paul. You're live as we're getting ready to get started. It's about 4 minutes of, and we should get started a little bit after 4. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll get started in about 3 minutes. Thanks for your patience. All right, Paul, it's a little around right around 4 o'clock. So anytime you want to get started, you might as well go ahead.
Okay, I'm ready. You want to put up the first slide?
Okie doke.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this safety briefing, safety session for our annual retreat. And today we're going to talk a little bit about winter flying and some of the things that to look for and to watch for. Most of us, and I'm sure all of you too, have received training on flying in the winter and cautions and that sort of thing. So much of this might be stuff you've heard before. Of course, we're big on recurrency training as pilots. And maybe you'll pick up something here that you haven't heard before that will be useful to you. Next slide, please. And I'm teaching this today or presenting it. My name is Paul Henderson. I'm the aviation safety officer for the Oregon wing of Angel Flight West. So I'm not going to be able to touch on everything. I mean, this is a huge subject. So I'm going to hit some highlights and maybe some points that I think it might be of some concern on a more immediate basis. So let's start off on the basis of saying you have volunteered for an Angel Flight mission, and you've been assigned the mission, and you are really eager to get out and meet your passengers and show everything that you can do in general aviation and get them to their appointment or from their appointment. Next slide, please. So there you are out at your airplane. Oh gosh, that was supposed to be a picture of me, but I guess I messed up. I got a picture of Rich Pickett in there instead. Out greeting his passengers, getting ready for Angel Flight. So next slide, please. Winter operation considerations. The biggest one, and the one we're going to spend some time on today, is weather and other things. Daylight is one that's a big concern for winter operations. I'm up in the Portland area, and in the middle of December, when we're getting around the solstice and the first day of winter, it's dark here at 4:30 in the afternoon. We make up for it in the summer, where it stays light till 9:30 or 10 sometimes. But as you probably know, Angel Flight has initiated a policy this year saying that you can only fly at night. You can only fly passengers at night if you are instrument rated and current. Even if you're flying VFR at night, you still have to have that requirement. So something to keep in mind as far as your own qualifications are concerned and as far as your own currency is concerned on night operations. I know I see some of the flights that are advertised on the AFW site, and it's departing from Boeing Field at 3:45 in the afternoon in January and flying to Idaho, where it's already an hour later. And that's going to be a situation where somebody is flying at night, so they need to meet those qualifications. And if you're going to do that, check on that. Fog is a big consideration. We get more of it, more widespread during the winter. Sometimes it's forecast, but it's difficult to forecast, and it's difficult to predict how long it's going to last. Generally, if you can avoid flying early in the morning, when you have advection fog issues, the dew point and the temperature close up on each other, and the moisture in the air condenses, and you get ground fog. Maybe it's only 50 feet thick, or even sometimes even less. But if you're doing an approach and it looks like you got pretty good visibility, these often come up in high pressure times. And then your last 50 feet, you're blind down to the runway. It's not a good situation. Other operating conditions that you want to consider, things like runways. What's the status on the runways? Are they covered with snow? Are they covered with ice? You can get braking action reports if you're going into a controlled airport. But if you're not, then you won't get those kind of reports. So calling ahead, checking it out, finding out whether or not you're going to be able to do that. Are you in snow? Generally, people say if you're going to have to land in snow or take off in snow, you should be using soft field takeoff and landing techniques to do that. So variables that you don't have when you're flying in the summer or dry conditions, warmer conditions. Next slide, please. So you're going to take off on this flight, and so what does the FAA require that you become familiar with before you're going to conduct this operation? Well, they make it pretty easy here in 91.103 with extremely clear directions that says you become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. So who can do that? Thanks FAA. But they do emphasize a couple of things that they look at that are extremely important. And if you have a problem and you haven't punched these tickets, you may find yourself under some sort of enforcement action. But we're not, I'm going to touch, on the FAA and how they get involved in enforcement on some of this stuff. But, it's really more of a safety concern than it is an enforcement or FAA compliance situation. Sometimes if you get into trouble in some of these situations, an enforcement action by the FAA is the least of your problems. But for flight under IFR or a flight not in the vicinity of the airport, weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternatives available if the planned flight cannot be completed, and any known traffic delays. Weather is the big issue for that. And we want to look at the total picture as far as weather is concerned. Nowadays with the weather that you can get over the internet, and the weather briefings you can get through various sources on that. I know a lot of pilots who will look at METARs and TAFs for their airports that are involved, and pretty much use that as a weather report. Keep in mind that METAR and that TAF is for a specific airport and within about 6 miles. So if there's a 5 miles. So if there's a thunderstorm 6 miles out from that airport, it's not going to show up on that weather briefing. So when do you get a weather briefing? How often should you get a weather briefing? Early and often is probably the best thing to say. The only thing the FAA has ever said about this is that in one enforcement action, the pilot had received a standard briefing 2 hours before his takeoff, and then called and got an abbreviated briefing. The standard briefing was over the internet, and got an abbreviated briefing by telephone 30 minutes prior to the launch of the mission. And the FAA said, that's adequate, that's sufficient. So you can use that as a guideline. Depending upon the weather, depending on the situation, you may want more than that. We also have other things that are available to us that we didn't have before, and weather in the cockpit, radar in the cockpit, that is tremendous help. So utilize those. Next slide, please. So that gets us to our sources for aviation weather. How do we find out what's going on? Years ago when I first started doing this, about the only thing we had available was 1-800 weather brief. We could call up and get a briefing from a briefer at Flight Service, and they would go through the standard weather briefing with you, advise you of NOTAMs, that sort of thing. And that is still available, and it's still worthwhile. One of the things I like to do sometimes is I get most of my weather through an online source, whether it's aviationweather.gov or ForeFlight. Those are all available to you, but I just like to touch bases with a briefer, say, before I'm going to go for an abbreviated briefing, and get that perspective, because there's sometimes I'll hear something verbally that I didn't catch. You know how long and involved those briefings are, the written briefings, particularly NOTAMs, which can go on for pages and pages and pages. And I like to get the input from a briefer who is looking specifically at the airports I'm going to utilize and my route of flight, and bring these things to my attention. It's important to, whether you're getting your briefing over the internet or whether you're getting a briefing from a briefer, that we pay attention to what they're saying. We do a lot of things in aviation that are done by rote. We pre-flight the airplane, we get weather briefings, we do checklists in the cockpit, we do that sort of thing. We do them over and over and over, and there can be a tendency sometimes to kind of rush through them. We've done this so many times, thinking of other things as they go along. The and we've all done, I've done that. The worst situation I ever heard about was talking with a briefer one time, a weather briefer. She was also a pilot and an air traffic controller, but she had worked as a weather briefer at flight service for some time. And she had a guy call, and he was going to do a flight in his Cherokee 6. He was taking his wife and 4 children. So they were going to fill up the airplane, and it was around the holidays. And she briefed him on the weather, and part of what she briefed was that on his route of flight, there were forecast embedded thunderstorms. And he sort of, She could tell he was busy on the other side. And when she got to the end, he says, okay, thanks. And then she heard him say, okay, kids, it's a go. And then cheering, children cheering in the background. And she stops and says, sir, did you hear that? Are you taking your children on this flight? Did you hear that there are embedded thunderstorms on your route of flight? Do you know what that may mean to you and your family? And she said he stopped and paused and said, okay, maybe we should do this again. So pay attention as you're going through in this, particularly in the winter where weather is challenging, no matter what source you're using to obtain the weather. But one thing, next slide, please. One source I would like to give you for weather information, which I have found is just an incredible resource on this. You'll get everything here. And it takes a little while to get used to it, to find your way around it, but it's aviationweather.gov. As you can see, just on this one page that I put up, you get advisories, forecasts, observations, tools, all the METARs, PIREPs, SIGMETs, AIRMETs, everything, convective charts on it, prognostic charts. It's all right there. It takes a little while, I think, to learn your way to navigate around this, but it is an incredible resource. I use ForeFlight a lot, and I use ForeFlight briefings, which is great because you put in your flight plan and they come back and give you a briefing on that whole flight plan. But I do like to go to aviation weather, particularly looking for things like icing forecasts that are really important this time of year. Next slide, please. So then when you get all of that information off of the weather briefing, then what I do then at that point is take that information and the weather and the forecast weather and then apply that to my personal minimums that I'm going to utilize during the flight. And I keep track of these, and they are ever changing. And what am I comfortable with, and what is my airplane capable of doing in terms of ceiling, visibility, the wind? You got enough strong enough wind. I don't care how good a pilot you are. When your controls get to the stop, there ain't no further. Is this going to be an IFR flight, a night flight? Are you going to be flying over mountains, over open water? What other requirements are required for that? And where is your comfort level? If I'm flying a lot and I'm doing a lot of approaches, then my personal minimum for ceilings at the destination airport on an ILS approach can be considerably lower than they are if I haven't flown for a while, and I don't feel, I may be legally current, but the question is, am I proficient? And how much should I raise those minimums for all that in order to do that? There are several good forums you can find. AOPA has one. If you simply Googled personal minimums, you'll find various forums that are available to you. You can use for checklists on that. And again, this is something I think that is should be updated often, depending on where you are in your flying. Next slide, please. This is important information because weather is the environment that we fly in all the time, that we operate in all the time. And it is the #1 most lethal condition in general aviation fatalities. And winter weather has challenges to it that can contribute to that quite a bit. So it's something, I mean, I don't have to tell you, any pilot that's in this organization, I don't have to tell you how careful you have to be on that, but let me re-emphasize it. Next slide, please. And this is one I think you're probably all familiar with as well. 63% of weather-related fatalities are due to continued flight into IMC. And we're not going to get more IMC, at least out here in the West, than we're going to find during the winter months on this. Important statistic to keep in mind. There's one other one here that is, I think, important as well. It says 74% of all weather accidents, not necessarily fatalities, but accidents, are caused by updrafts, downdrafts, winds, and turbulence. Next slide, please. So, you ever had your airplane looking like this? I mean, not a TBM necessarily, but covered in ice. It's most of us, myself, I fly an airplane that is not certified to fly into known icing conditions. And we get icing conditions quite a bit, particularly out here in the West, where we have generally low freezing levels in the winter and high MEAs if we're flying in instrument flight plans. We got a lot of mountains out here. In order to get across them, you have to get up there high, and that's where you start getting into icing conditions. Let's go next slide, please. Let's go back to what the FAA says about operating in icing conditions. And it's kind of confusing here. I know I have pondered this several times, but there is some guidance on it, and I'll get into that. It says you can't take off in an airplane that has frost or snow or ice adhering to propeller, windshield, stabilizing control surface, which makes sense, although every year somebody or several people will try to do that, take off with a frosted airplane. Generally, frost on the wings of an airplane, just on sitting on the ground, can reduce lift by about 30% and increase drag by about 40%. So it says you can't fly under IFR into known or forecast light or moderate icing conditions, or VFR into known light or moderate icing conditions, unless you're equipped to do it, unless the aircraft is equipped to do it. So what are known icing conditions on that? Well, there's several indicators on that. You know, if you fly IFR, especially if you fly IFR out here in the West, you know, we get forecast icing reports, and sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they're not accurate. But particularly if we're flying with passengers, we need to be on the deferring to caution on this, because ice can happen very, very quickly, can deteriorate your performance dramatically in a relatively short period of time. If you've ever flown into a bad icing condition, you know what I'm talking about. It's only happened to me once, and the ice was not forecast at the time. But I built up very, very quickly, and down to the point of where I was losing airspeed and I was having a difficult time maintaining altitude. I had an escape route, available to me, and I probably should have declared an emergency at that time because it was deteriorating that quickly. Fortunately, I got to a place where ATC could put me could put me down to a lower altitude where it warmed up and the ice came off the airplane. But it was a frightening, frightening experience. One of the things that's important about this is the statistic, I didn't write it down, I read it fairly recently, is that pilots who report icing and get it to the point of where they're requesting diversion to an alternate airport, less than half of them make it to that airport. So if you have icing conditions, you're picking up ice on the airplane, and you're not equipped to fly in icing conditions, report it quickly and look for ways out quickly. Sometimes it's appropriate to declare an emergency. Don't worry, nobody's going to make you write reports or anything like that. They just want to get you someplace where you're going to be safe. Known icing. Where is known icing? Well, there's if you get a pilot report and somebody's reporting icing at a certain altitude in an area where you know you're going to be, that's known icing. It's there and somebody's seen it and they report it to you. But other than that, the FAA did an enforcement action back in 2009. They wrote a letter called the Bell Letter that describes known icing. And they came out and said, if the composite information indicates to a reasonable and prudent pilot that he or she will be operating the aircraft under conditions that will cause ice to adhere to the aircraft along the proposed route and altitude of flight, then known icing conditions likely exist. Paraphrasing that down before, they said, known icing conditions involve circumstances where a reasonable pilot would expect a substantial likelihood of ice formations on the aircraft based upon information available to the pilot. That's kind of legalese language, and this is a likelihood which is generally considered to be greater than 50%. So if you can say to yourself, well, there's a 51% chance that I will be picking up ice along that route, that constitutes known icing, and you are prohibited from flying into that unless, under item D, you get a updated forecast of icing conditions will not be encountered at that time. There are other places where you've got known icing where you could still fly. For example, if the tops of the clouds are at 7,000 feet and your altitude that you're going is at 10,000 feet, and you can depart from the departure airport and get on top before you're going through the clouds. And if your destination airport is again VFR, you can get down through that without going through those clouds, then you can make it under those circumstances. Next slide. Conditions for icing. Well, you can see it there. The static air temperature between +2 centigrade and -20 centigrade, which in Fahrenheit is 35.6 to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. There's an important note in here. It says the more hazardous ice shapes tend to form at temperatures closer to freezing. So at that freezing level, that, from that 35.6 degrees down to, in Fahrenheit, down to 30 or so, 29, that's when the ice is closest to a liquid form. And what happens then is when you hit when the ice forms on your airframe at that point, it will hit the propeller, it will hit the wings, it will hit the horizontal stabilizer, and it doesn't freeze immediately. So it will flow back along the wing, for example, and then where it gets into different shapes that are irregular and will disrupt the airflow more substantially than drier air and colder temperatures, which generally will produce a rime ice. It can still, rime will still, if any of you ever been in it, will still disrupt your airflow, but not as drastically. The colder it is, the less moisture is in the air itself, so the buildup tends to be slower and not as irregular. Same is true with snow. If you wind up flying into snow, which you should really consider as being an icing condition, but when you're down, and this is so often it happens, I know up here in the Pacific Northwest, your freezing level is going to be close to your MEA, and you get in that, you get into snow and ice, and it's toward the warmer end of it, and around the freezing level, and you get more clear ice buildup or mixed ice buildup that are in irregular shapes, which make it all that much more hazardous. You can look for alternate routes. I've flown up from the Bay Area before where I could not get across the Siskiyous because the MEA was so high and the freezing level was low enough to where it was unsafe to do that. So you can take a look at things like there are routes that go out over the coast where the MEA is much, much lower and you can get below that freezing level. So if you can find alternatives to do that, by all means, please do. Next slide, please. This is just kind of a chart of what I was talking about before, based upon what the temperatures are. And you get to that range there of 0 degrees centigrade to minus 15 degrees centigrade. And that's where you get super cool liquid, significant icing threat, and a quicker buildup, more irregular buildup. So the closer you are to the freezing level when you're picking up ice, the more hazardous the ice accumulation can be. Of course, if you're above freezing, all you're going to get is moisture. And if you get up high enough, low enough temperatures, there's no moisture in those, or very, very little, so you won't get ice buildups at that point too. Next slide, please. Okay, another hazard. This is a picture of me almost 30 years ago. And let me talk you through this picture a little bit. We're going to talk about another winter flying hazard. If you'll notice, my left hand is holding what looks like a piece of broken plastic, which is exactly what that is, because that's what is left of the windscreen after a goose flies through it. And if you go down along the wing down toward the end, this is kind of a distorted picture. I don't have other pictures. I'm sorry, they got lost somewhere, which was kind of a disappointment to me. So this is the best one that I had of this. But take a look at the end of the wing down there, and that's about where 3 or 4 geese flew into the wing. The migration system, which starts in the fall and runs through the winter with Canadian geese, presents significant hazards to all of us. And we've all seen them up there. This happened to me at night, flying into Pearson Field just across the river from Portland. And I was all lit up, but I didn't see the geese. I saw the geese because I had my landing light on, but I didn't see them until about 2 seconds before they hit the airplane. Caused substantial damage to the airplane. If you'll notice on my chin down there, I've got a dressing on there because I had some stitches across my face where the bird went by and scraped me on the way. I am fortunate that it didn't come through my side of the windscreen. Anybody who wants to hear this whole story, I'll be glad to tell it to you sometime, but I will tell you that when you get that kind of damage to an airplane, with all that wind going into the cockpit and all that damage to the wing, it was bent back almost to the spar. The airplane flies real funny. That much wind in the cockpit and the nose wants to come up, and they got considerable yaw off of that. Hitting a goose is about the same as hitting a bowling ball. They're having a bowling ball hit you at about, well, however fast you're going. I was going about 100 knots. And the geese were flying exactly the opposite direction at probably about 30 knots. So it's like getting hit by a bowling ball that's going 150 miles an hour. Causes substantial damage. What can you do about that? Well, not be aware is one. I would recommend at night, if you can, avoid approaches and departures over water, over wetlands, over places where geese like to congregate. When I see geese during the day, they're usually flying 300 to 500 feet above the ground. At night, I was at 1,000 feet when they hit me. I have heard reports of people seeing geese or encountering geese at 10,000 feet at night. So it's a threat. But I would recommend that you try to avoid approaches and departures after dark over wetlands. It's still a risk even during daylight, but you can see and avoid, hopefully. If you do see geese, then the other thing that I would recommend off of this is that you climb above them, or at least at the same level with them, because the protective reaction that a goose has to a predator, and that's how the goose will perceive you, is to tuck their wings in and dive. And most of the damage to my airplane came from above. And next slide, please. Here's an example of another. This was a goose strike, and you can see how it came down and went from above, went down straight through the windscreen off of this. It's no joke when you get hit by one of these things, believe me. Okay, another area let's move on to, and we'll say that, next slide, please. For whatever reason, bad weather, problem with the aircraft, something, you have to set the airplane down during the winter. And let's say you're in a remote area. So you did a good job here and you got the airplane down. It's busted up, but so what? Insurance will cover that. You and your passengers get out and you're unscathed, or maybe minor injuries on that. But what happens then? You're out in the middle of nowhere and it's cold. And there may be rescue operations coming to get you, but that's going to take a while under the best of circumstances for them to get up and going. And if you, for example, were put down because of weather, well, they're going to have the same problem. So there's going to be delayed for them getting into you. And in the meantime, there you are. So what do you need to do? Next slide, please. Survive. And why you should carry, especially during the winter months, you should carry survival equipment with you. You know, if you fly in Alaska, even during the summer, you're required to carry minimum survival equipment, and that increases over the amount you're required to carry increases during the winter. Food, water, communication, by that, you know, a handheld radio, a personal locator device, a strobe light, flares, that sort of thing. So you can communicate with the people who are trying to help you. Cell phone, if you can get coverage on it. But the biggest thing I'm going to emphasize to you in this kind of a situation is warmth. You need to have, I'd add a first aid kit to this too, but you can survive without food for weeks, and you can survive without water for days. If you get in a cold weather situation, in a winter situation in the mountains, you may not make it an hour before you succumb to hypothermia if you cannot stay warm. So fire making abilities, warm clothing, you'll knit hats. You'll lose 90% of your body heat sometimes to your head, because the body supplies a steady blood flow to the brain, and then the heat can escape out the top of your head. It escapes out the top of my head a lot faster than most people. And also warmth to your core. A lot of times, if you get, you know how your fingers get stiff and that when you're cold, you can correct that sometimes by putting on a down vest or something that warms your trunk, because the body will pull blood away from the extremities to keep the core and the brain warm. So warmth is very, very important off of that. I can't emphasize that enough if you're in a cold weather situation. Also, recommend if you do have to go down, stay with the airplane unless you can get to, you absolutely know you can get to civilization or some other assistance or help quickly. Because what happens is they'll put out a search for you, and what they're looking for is the airplane. And if you take off, once they find the airplane, then they have to start the second search, which is to find you. And who knows which way you went. And you're not as easy to spot from the air as an aircraft is. Next slide. You can find lots of books and YouTube programs on this subject. I think it's helpful to carry a pocket survival kit, because if you have to get out of that airplane and you cannot get to a bigger survival kit, at least you've got some fire starting materials on you and a flare pistol, so you can hopefully survive and get signaling out to other people. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because, like I said, you will find resources everywhere about this. Excuse me. If you go to the Alaska Aviation website, they'll give everything that you're required to carry in the state of Alaska for both summer and winter operations. Next slide. Many of which are carried or are on this list right here. But if you forget everything else in winter operations, next slide, remember this. It has to be your number one priority. Get a fire going, get to shelter, deal with injuries as you can, put on a hat, cover your upper torso, eat. Calories will warm you up as well. Next slide. Training resources. You know, there are so many now. There are courses you can take. There are courses you can buy. You can go to Sporties. You can go to all sorts of different organizations that will give you resources and training and all of these things that we're talking about today and more. The two that I like a lot, and I like them because, number one, they're very professionally done, and number two, they're free. And the first one is FAAsafety.gov. They have webinars, seminars, papers, videos. They have all sorts of things. It's amazing what the FAA has done on this. I mean, we all gripe about the FAA, but they have done a tremendous job on this. You can sign up and get online notices of their webinars. I get them all the time. They're on weather situations, communications, you name it. You can pick and choose off of that. Very good resource. I highly recommend it. Take some time, go to the website, and just peruse through it and find all the resources available. That's also where you'll find out about the WINGS program if you're interested in that. The other source that I like a lot is the AOPA Air Safety Institute. They do seminars and that, but they have some tremendous videos that are available to you. And again, it's free. And they use computer generated reenactments of typically of accidents that happen. A lot of them have to do with cold weather. A lot of them have to do with bad weather. And they're extremely helpful and instructional. They're not too long. Usually they don't go more than 15 to 20 minutes. But there's a lot of them, and they're very, very valuable, I think, to you. One of the things we do as pilots, and I have done this myself, is when we read accident reports and we find out what other people did and how they crashed and how they made these mistakes, and people got hurt and aircraft got bent. And pilots are, in my experience, some of the most critical, judgmental, unforgiving people out there. And they'll all say, oh, I'd never do that. I would never do that. I can't believe how stupid that guy was. He didn't know what he was doing, or he's unqualified, yada, yada, yada. I would be willing to bet that all of those people who you are judging like that made the same comment at one time or another. But when I start thinking, oh boy, I'd never do that. I'm too smart for that. I've got too many hours. I got too many ratings. That never happened to me. I think of two people. Next slide. Scott Crossfield, if you're old enough, you probably remember this guy. He was in the early 50s. He was in the competition with Chuck Yeager a lot for setting altitude records, speed records, and so on. He was the first man to fly twice the speed of sound, set some other records. He was also the first person to pilot the X-15 space plane. Quite a famous and noted pilot with tremendous experience in a variety of different aircraft, flying in very dangerous conditions. In 2006, he took off from Alabama after delivering a speech to some newly commissioned Air Force officers, was flying back home across the Appalachian Mountains in his Cessna 210. He did get a weather briefing, but he didn't get a current weather briefing. And there was a line of embedded thunderstorms across the Appalachians, which he flew into. Contributing to the accident was the fact that the controller, who he was dealing with at the time, didn't tell him about the weather threat either. Well, the controller survived okay, but Scott Crossfield did not. His airplane crashed, and it was spread out over about 3 miles, which indicated that it had broken up in the air, and of course he was killed. Guy who just made a mistake and didn't give a weather briefing. Next slide, please. The other guy I think of is this, Steve Fawcett. He has the job we all want. He was a professional adventurer, and he did all kinds of things and set all kinds of records in boats and skis, and he was the first person to fly solo around, circumnavigate the globe in a balloon. He was the first person to circumnavigate the globe in a powered aircraft, nonstop, not refueled, solo. Interesting guy. In 2007, he was flying in the Sierra Nevada, looking for a dry lake bed where he could run some of his motorized vehicles. I'm not sure what it was. We looked for some places where he could do speed runs. He was in a Citabria, heavy winds that day. He got down low, close to the mountains, as he was looking for things. Nobody knows exactly what happened. One witness at one point said before his crash that it looked like he was stopped dead in the air. The most likely explanation is that low in the high winds, he hit a downdraft. He didn't have enough power to get up above it, and it put his airplane down in the mountains where he was killed. His body wasn't discovered for over a year after that, and all that was left was a couple of bones. So I don't have the credentials of Scott Crossfield or Steve Fawcett. And so I'm going to be the last person in the world to sit and say, I'd never do that. That would never happen to me, because it could happen to me. And that's why we all need to pay attention to these things. Safety is really important. Next slide. Okay, that's all I have on our presentation here. Anybody who has any questions or comments, I guess, Stefan, you can pick those up and pass them on. Because I don't know, let's see, Q&A.
We have one question in the Q&A. If you've got the window open, or I could read it to you.
Okay, I've got it. Flight at night. I hear folks talk about IFR mountains and night, choose one. I've always been heard it as choose two. I'll do two of those. I'll fly at night. I'll fly IFR, but I won't do it over the mountains. So yeah, I think the point is when you get up there and you have all of those things that can contribute. If you're IFR at night, it's bad enough if you're over the mountains during the day and you have an engine failure. Where are you going to put that airplane down? If it's at night, you got no place really that, or your options are extremely, extremely limited. So no, I won't do it. I will fly IFR at night, and I know that it just depends on what your comfort level is with that. I've had a lot of guys I know who are former military pilots, and they're all flying twin engine airplanes, and they won't fly a single engine airplane at night. They just absolutely won't do it. Where your comfort level is, I will, because I was trained on that and I did it the whole time. But my thoughts are no, not on all three. Next, it might be a point to make that even Fiki aircraft are only designed to get out of icing conditions. Also with SLD, all bets are off. That's absolutely true. I don't talk a lot about Fiki aircraft because I don't own one, but yes, that is true. The systems on there are, well, you have anti-icing and de-icing systems that are on that. I have some anti-icing systems on my airplane. I have a defroster that goes on the windscreen, which it doesn't do much if it's going to pick up ice. And I have pitot heat. And I keep the pitot heat on, I think, as we all should if we're going to be flying in the clouds at all, because that can pick up and clog there and affect your instruments off of it. But yeah, ice is just, it is so dangerous that you need to get out of it. Now, if you've got a powerful enough airplane where you can climb out of it, that's a really good option. But if you're flying a 172 or a Piper Archer or even more capable airplanes than that, you may not have the ability to get out of that, to climb out of it. Particularly, like I say, up here in this area in the West and the Pacific Northwest, where freezing levels are low and cloud tops are real high, and you're simply not going to make it. But you're right, all bets are off when you run into those freezing pellets, like freezing rain covers the wings, the propeller. Extremely, extremely dangerous. And this has never happened to me to this extent, but I read about it, and the airplane quits flying. You get warning because the airspeed will bleed off and your ability to hold altitude diminishes. But when it finally gives up, it just gives up, and you stall the airplane and it's going down. Anyone else?
While we're waiting for additional questions, let me just remind everybody that we have a whole slate of sessions tomorrow and Thursday. So please take a look at the list on the webpage that you got the link for this session for, and see if there are other sessions you might be interested in. If you enjoyed this session, Paul will be repeating this on Thursday. And we have another safety session as well on Thursday. So a lot to look forward to. But I guess if we don't have any other questions, we can wrap things up with our thanks to Paul.
Okay, thanks very much.